Welcome to our virtual session on state AG practice and the Biden administration, which will be presented by NPs Erica Buckley, Travis Hill, Rob Fisher, and Michal Ovadia. The following content should not be construed as legal advice, and the attendees should not act upon information in this presentation without professional counsel. Attendees should seek advice applicable to their specific situation. The examples and information contained herein are for educational purposes only. And now I'd like to turn it over to Erica Buckley, who will begin today's program.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Erica Buckley, and I'm a partner in Nixon Peabody's New York City and Albany office. I lead the firm's full-service co-op and condo practice, which does do a fair amount of work before the Attorney General's office, both regulatory and government investigation work. I'm also the co-lead of Nixon Peabody's newly formed state attorneys general practice, which we're excited to talk about today, and all of us are members of. Without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce one of our panelists, Travis Hill, who is going to be one of our speakers today. Travis is a new partner to Nixon, and he's a member of our government investigations and white collar practice group, and he practices out of New York City. And Travis has a tremendous amount of experience with government investigations, internal investigations, trial and appellate litigation work as well. I'm very excited to introduce Travis. And Travis comes to us from the New York Attorney General's office, where he held two incredibly prestigious positions that make him well qualified as a panelist today. Prior to joining Nixon, Travis was the former chief of the Public Integrity Unit at the Attorney General's office, and he was also the head of the Real Estate Enforcement Unit. And in addition to his extensive time at the New York Attorney General's office, Travis was also a former U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to my co-moderator, Michal.
Thanks, Erica. Hi, everyone. My name is Michal Ovadia. I'm an associate based in Nixon Peabody's Long Island office. My practice has two general areas of focus, the first being governmental and internal investigations, the second being regulatory healthcare law, specifically medical staff issues and graduate medical education matters. I'm pleased to introduce another one of our panelists today, Rob Fisher, a partner in our Boston office. Prior to joining Nixon Peabody, Rob served as an assistant U.S. attorney for almost a decade, with much of his time spent in the Public Corruption and Special Investigations Unit. Rob has experience leading complex and high-profile white-collar prosecutions involving bribery, healthcare fraud, RICO conspiracies, and much more. Rob has received a number of awards and accolades over the course of his career, including his recent nomination by the Massachusetts governor to serve as a member of the Commonwealth's Task Force on the Preservation of Evidence. Most recently, and perhaps most interestingly, Rob appears in the Netflix special Operation Varsity Blues, the college admissions scandal, which I highly recommend everyone check out. Back to you, Erica.
Okay, I think now, before we get started with our line of questioning, I think both Rob and Travis would like to give some opening remarks. This is obviously an incredibly charged topic, talking about state attorneys general in light of the Biden administration. So Rob, Travis, do you guys want to give us some opening remarks before we start grilling you with all of our questions?
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, I'll kick it off. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Michal and Erica, for your introductions and for moderating this discussion this afternoon. My name is Travis Hill, and I'm happy to speak with you all about state AG's practice and the new Biden administration and the impact that it will have on the practice of the various state AGs. The breadth of state AG practice is wide and expanding. What used to be essentially a state-based consumer protection practice has become a nationwide legal powerhouse, active not only in their own individual state courts, but also in federal district court, the federal circuits, and the Supreme Court, leading the way in the most complex legal issues of our time, such as environmental protection, healthcare, immigration, antitrust, and cybersecurity, often rivaling the legal reach and influence of the U.S. Department of Justice. State AGs, especially states such as California, New York, Texas, and Massachusetts, are strong, fully engaged and here to stay. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Travis. Thanks for having me here today. As McCall said, I'm a former AAG in Massachusetts. I was also a longtime federal prosecutor here in Massachusetts and worked for the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. So I have a lot of experience in terms of dealing with regulators and not only the AGs, but the DOJ. And hopefully what we'll cover more here today, what Travis already mentioned, is the powerful AGs, and I think how powerful they've become more powerful over the past 4 years during the Trump administration. I think what you saw with DOJ and different federal regulators sort of scale back enforcement priorities, and the AGs, I think, filled that void. You know, they jumped into that vacuum, and they've done a lot of good work. They've been very aggressive, and what I've seen is they brought in a lot of money to the state coffers. And now, of course, we're going through a major financial crisis, and I think states and localities need more money, more income. So I think what you'll see is this continued aggressiveness of the AGs, even though I think under Biden and his administration with DOJ and the regulators, SEC, FINRA, whatnot, they will also be aggressive. But I don't think the states will retreat because they've gotten used to playing a larger role. And frankly, are going to be relying upon the increased monies that they've recouped through fines and forfeiture. So with that, I'll turn it over, I think, to, I don't know who's asking the first set of questions, maybe Erica.
Yes, it's me. So, all right, getting started. We're going to start off with a softball topic today, which is scandals in government. You know, something that I think those of us from New York and Massachusetts are no stranger to. And I'm going to start with Travis, although at any time, if McCall or Rob want to jump in because there's just something you have to say, I think we want to keep the discussion lively. But the first topic I want to talk about is what's going on in New York. Obviously, you know, New York is no stranger to corruption investigations, just, you know, a lot of things going on with our elected officials. Travis, you're the former head of the Public Integrity Unit at the AG's office. And so you must have something to say with what's going on with our governor. And, you know, just to set the tone, our governor is currently a target of an AG investigation, also an FBI investigation, as well as state legislative impeachment proceedings. And from a legal perspective, that just, to me, raises so many questions, like which proceeding prevails? How can they all do it at once? There's a lot to talk about, and I would love to hear what you have to say.
Absolutely. Thank you, Erica. Well, first, I want to take a quick step back and kind of talk a little bit about how we got to this position where, you know, attorney generals are taking over these special investigations. And here in New York, in particular, focused on the actions of the sitting governor. So in the past few years, there's been a lot of issues raised about police-involved misconduct and police shootings. And in particular, you've had 2 major cases in the past year, one involving George Floyd's murder in Minnesota, the other involving the murder of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. And both of those cases involved the attorney generals stepping in as special prosecutors instead of the local prosecutors handling that. And in addition, you have states such as New York who have established the attorney general as kind of a standing special prosecutor in those type of police involved shooting cases to handle those investigations and prosecutions. And the idea there is to have a more independent body, a prosecutor who's further removed from local law enforcement. And the fear is that local prosecutors in the county where these incidents occur are more closely aligned and work hand in hand with local law enforcement, local police departments. And so they're concerned about their independence. And so it's placed in the hands of the attorney general. So now you have former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who's currently standing trial in Minnesota and being prosecuted by the AG's office. And you had the investigation in Kentucky handled by the AG's office, which led to some related indictments, not directly for the murder of Breonna Taylor, but other actions involved in that particular warrant execution and what went wrong there. So you have an idea in the general public and in the legal sphere as well, that attorney generals are more of an independent actor, and that's why they're chosen for these special investigations. Here in New York, you have a very complex investigation involving the sitting governor, and it involves allegations of sexual harassment. Now, typically, that's something that will be handled by many organizations or agencies in-house, by their HR department, or they may go directly to an outside law firm to conduct an investigation. And if any of you have been following in the news, which many of you, especially those who are joining us from New York, probably have been, it started out with the governor actually saying that he was going to appoint his own independent investigator from a private law firm. But the Attorney General's office said, no, no, no. We need to have jurisdiction to do that investigation our own. And if we want to appoint an outside law firm, we will do so. And so there were also, similar to the concerns involved with police-involved shootings, concerns that the governor's office, the executive office of New York State, appointing their own investigator, they were too close to the allegations. And there were concerns in the public and from other politicians that this would not be a fair and independent investigation. So ultimately, the Attorney General's office was called in. Also, you have other parallel proceedings taking place, investigations, one being conducted by the Judiciary Committee of the State Assembly. They are doing a preliminary investigation as to whether impeachment of the governor is warranted under the current circumstances. You also have the Eastern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office conducting a criminal investigation in regards to the executive office's handling of data related to deaths at nursing homes or related to nursing homes during the pandemic over the past year, and whether or not any of that data was falsified and submitted to the federal government. So you have 3 separate investigations going on, each very important. I think at this point, you can kind of look at the federal government investigation and the state investigation separately. Certainly they're going to proceed on their own tracks. And I don't think either one takes precedent over the other. If the Eastern District decides that there are criminal charges to be brought, they're going to bring their indictment. And likewise, the Attorney General's investigation into sexual misconduct and the Assembly's investigation as to whether or not impeachment is warranted are going to proceed on their own track, and they're going to issue reports in due course. What's more interesting are the competing investigations on the state side and which one is going to take precedent ultimately. I think the impeachment investigation is more of a long game, and the sexual misconduct investigation has a head start. So I think that's going to move forward more swiftly, and you're going to see a report coming out of the AG's office, I think, earlier than you will see a final report and determination from the state assembly.
I guess I have a couple of follow-ups, and that was a very detailed summary of what's going on. 2 things that sort of stood out to me on this issue. One is the fact that the AG is using an outside law firm, and 2, the fact that some of the women that have accused the governor of wrongdoing are refusing to participate in the impeachment proceedings. What do you think of those 2 things?
It's very interesting, the use of an outside law firm. So also in the Derek Chauvin prosecution, the Minnesota AG's office brought in outside counsel from law firms to participate in that prosecution as well. And I think it brings to note the importance that we can't forget that AGs, for the most part, except for a few exceptions, are elected officials. And many of these individuals have not been long practicing attorneys. They've been long time elected officials. And so there's a political aspect to this as well. And they want to be viewed as completely above board, completely independent. Certainly the Attorney General, when you're talking about New York, is historically been seen as a stepping stone to the governor's office. And I think in an abundance of caution, an outside law firm was brought in there to head up the investigation, so there were no allegations of political influence over the investigation. In the Derek Chauvin matter, I think once again, you have an AG in Minnesota who had been a longtime politician, a member of Congress, And he ultimately brought in members from outside law firms to participate in the prosecution. And I think, again, it goes to the public perception, to not wanting to be seen as being a political opportunist, and taking that part of the equation out of it, so that it can be seen as fair and just as possible as these matters move forward publicly.
Yeah, I guess.
Travis, I actually have a question about Shaw. Don't you think it's speaking as somebody who was at an AG's office, like myself, I get the political aspect, and why in New York you would want to bring in an outside law firm who maybe doesn't report directly to the AG over an investigation of the governor. But when you're dealing with the Chauvin case, and I understand why the AG's office would take that, not a local, DA. Typically you'd see the federal government step in and bring a civil rights action and just have the FBI take it over. But they must have felt like they couldn't sustain those charges. But the fact that you have an AG in that case, which is a fairly straightforward case, at least I think, from a crime perspective, bring in an outside law firm, that's one thing. But do you think it's unusual they brought in lawyers from Washington, D.C. and didn't just use local lawyers? And speaking as, I was at the AG's office. We had hundreds of attorneys. We had a lot of litigators. I tried a lot of cases. I'm sure you did. It makes one wonder. You had nobody in the AG's office that could try that case?
No, absolutely. I thought the same thing. I thought, it's very strange that they brought in outside counsel in that type of case. It's not the typical. But I think, one, in terms of, and this goes to the first part of your question, which is why do they bring them in the first place? I think one part of it was because some of the initial statements that the AG in Minnesota had made publicly when the events first took place, that I think complicated his path forward to handle it just in-house. So I think that was a big part of it. And then two, initially there was some coordination between the local prosecutor and the AG's office in Minnesota. And I think they wanted to make sure that they were fully distanced from some of those initial decisions that were made by the local prosecutor in Hennepin County, as well as those decisions that were influenced by working with the local prosecutor. So I think that's the primary reason why they brought in outside counsel. I have no idea why they were bringing in attorneys from Washington, D.C., other than they brought in Neil Katyal, who was one of the preeminent appellate attorneys in the nation. So, his expertise, I guess, is always appreciated, especially since he's deeply involved in criminal appeals and Supreme Court arguments from that area. But it's very unusual that you would go outside of your jurisdiction and bring in someone from a completely different part of the country. So I agree with you 100% on that.
Okay, so before we close the loop on what's going on in New York, I'm just going to ask you, not hold you to it, nor will any of our viewers, how long do you think all of this is going to take, Travis? And then we'll move on to another topic.
I think the sexual misconduct investigation out of the AG's office, you're most likely going to see a report by sometime in the summer. I think the Judiciary Committee's investigation out of the State Assembly, you're probably looking at late summer, early fall at the earliest, I would guess. And I'm hard pressed on the timeline of the Eastern District and their criminal investigation. Who knows how far along they are? That's much more secretive than what's going on publicly with these other investigations. And so, I think that could be in the near future or sometime later this year. I really have no idea as to that timeline.
Okay, well, we won't hold you to it, but thank you for sharing your predictions. Okay, so we're gonna move on to Rob. As Mikal said in the opening remarks, Rob is now not only a rock star attorney, but he's a superstar because he's in films now. That's what he's doing in his spare time. No, in all seriousness, Rob, you have been involved with Varsity Blues, and you were featured in the Netflix series on Varsity Blues, and you did a great job, and it was just fascinating. I have no idea whether or not what happened in Varsity Blues has any ability to replicate itself, if there's the possibility that different state AGs may be looking for more similar cases. So why don't you tell everyone in our audience what the heck is Varsity Blues, and what do you think is potentially on the horizon? Because it was quite a big deal.
Sure. Yeah, no, and thank you for that wind up, that introduction. And I encourage everybody to watch the Netflix documentary called Operation Varsity Blues. I think it was well done. I am in it. I'm also going to be in another Netflix production coming out April 7th about the Gardner Museum robbery, of course, with Brian Kelly. So there's a plug for that too. But I do have to be a little bit reserved in what I say about Operation Varsity Blues, because I was in the documentary and they limited what I spoke about there. And it was, I tried to focus on my first client, John Vandemore, who was the Stanford sailing coach. I currently have two other defendants. Both have pled guilty. Two former CEOs who got wrapped up in this, and they still await sentencing. So because I have two cases open, I have to be a bit careful on commenting on the open prosecution. But as I'm sure a lot of people know and have heard in the popular press, Operation Varsity Blues was essentially a racketeering scheme organized by Rick Singer. And Rick Singer is sort of the protagonist. Also in the movie, he's played by Matthew Modine. And they were able to put together this story because of the wiretap evidence. And they were able to get actors to play not only Rick Singer, but also some of the parents. And the scheme was Rick Singer found a way called the side door to get kids into highly selective universities, Stanford, Georgetown, USC in California. And how he would do that is he would find coaches like my former client, John Vandemore, who ran the sailing program at Stanford. And he would, in John's case, donate money, large sums of money. For John, it was over $700,000 to the program, but other coaches were just taking the money and putting it in their pocket, allegedly. Those are the allegations. And in return for the money, the bribes, the coaches would put those student athletes, so to speak, on their team, whether it was water polo, sailing, fencing, you name it. And that was the side door. You get in, it's a lot easier to get in if you're somebody who is chosen by one of these coaches. You're I think at Stanford, your acceptance rate typically is, I think, 5% or less for most students that apply. If you get what's called a pink envelope, which is you've been selected by a varsity coach to be on a team, your acceptance rate goes up to 80%, sometimes 90%. So that's why you saw these parents willing to spend large sums of money to get their kids in the side door. Because as we all know, you can get your kids in the back door, which is a large donation to the school, but that's going to be in the millions of dollars before you get their attention. I've heard stories while being involved in this case that some of the Ivies in most prestigious universities, parents from overseas and internationally will show up at admissions and say, tell me how much money I have to pay. I'll write you a check for 50 million if that's what it takes. And what the schools say is, well, that's great, but you don't get to jump the line in front of everybody else. We've had parents who have been donating millions for years and have likely given $50 million. So they get to stay where they are in line. You don't get to jump it. And I think what it highlights when you watch the film, I think it really distills how competitive college has become for not only students, but their parents, right? And I think you wonder for a lot of the parents who you see in the film, why, and some of the students you hear from in the film, why it is so competitive, right? Like our students, do they really want to go to these schools because there's a certain professor there or a certain program there, or is it really just a prestige, right? And they want to say, I got into this school, my son or daughter, they got into this school, and that's what I want to tell my friends and family. So I think the film does a really good job of distilling that. But and I say this in the film, what is unusual about this case is it's a racketeering conspiracy, but usually in racketeering conspiracies, the feds target a low-level member of the conspiracy, either a buyer or a low-level seller of, say, cocaine, right? Or with the mafia, maybe somebody who's out breaking legs, collecting money. and you flip that person to get to the figurehead, right? To get to the person in the center of the conspiracy who you want to bring down, right? Here, it was the complete opposite. You had, the person that cooperated first was Rick Singer. He's the head of the organization, right? He's the top of the pyramid. And yet you used him to get all the people below him. So that you don't see that often, if ever, in federal prosecutions or in racketeering conspiracies. So that is very different, where the feds spent a lot of time and money building a case to get the folks that really were participants and not, the leader of the organization, who was Rick Singer. So that's what's a bit unusual, at least in my mind.
And do you think that that's something that we'll see replicated? It makes me sort of think of like Preet Bharara was really big on neither admit nor deny. Like that language under him went away, and it's had a really big consequence on government investigations. So do you think we'll see something similar?
I'm not sure. No, I think, and I think this is probably a one-off, right? I don't think you're going to see something like this again. The other unusual aspect from my point of view, and I argued this to the judge for Vandermoor, I couldn't find another fraud case where the victim of the fraud, in my case, the victim was Stanford, that's how it was charged, came ahead at the end of the fraudulent conspiracy with more money than when the conspiracy began, right? Stanford ended up $770,000 richer. Now, I know they donated that money, or at least they say they did, but that's a very unusual fraud scheme, right? I think we can all agree with that. And I think that's one of the reasons my client did very well and didn't have to serve time. But no, I'm not sure you'll see anything similar to this, right? I think everybody's kind of learned their lesson. You definitely have the general deterrent effect. Forget about the specific deterrent effect. These parents, I'm sure, never, or anybody involved in this, are never going to partake in activity like this again. And I'm not sure the state AGs, they may look a bit at some of the state schools to make sure this isn't occurring, but I have a hard time believing you're going to see something like this in our generation. Maybe after people forget about it, but I think for the next 10, 20, 30 years, this is not going to happen again.
Well, I think that'll be a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are coming right up on time. So I'm going to just ask one of my other topics before I turn it over to Michal. And of course, I couldn't skip housing. We've got to talk about housing. And so this one's going to go to Travis. Travis, you and I were on a panel together on Friday, and we highlighted to our audience the fact that the New York Attorney General has 4 different units or bureaus focusing on housing. And I don't think neither you nor I see that slowing down. So what do you see on the horizon in the housing space under a Biden administration?
Sure, absolutely. So, I agree 100%. Housing, real estate, and tenant issues are going to be a priority across the country. I think even for AG's offices who weren't focused in this space prior to the pandemic, as a result of the economic fallout from the pandemic and the vast foreclosure and eviction moratoriums across the country, they're focused on it now. Minnesota is doing a lot of work in the space. DC has a Tenant Receivership Act where they can actually appoint a receiver to oversee rental properties where there's chronic issues of health or safety concerns. And as you mentioned, the New York Attorney General's office has been focused on it, and they'll continue to be focused in this area. On the criminal side of the house, they have the Real Estate Enforcement Unit that's investigating financial fraud related to real estate industry, as well as unlawful eviction and tenant harassment. So dealing with treatment of rental tenants. And then on the civil side of the house at the New York AG's office, they have the Real Estate Finance Bureau, and they have consumer frauds, and they have a new housing protection unit, all focused on issues regarding civil enforcement under the Martin Act, which is New York's blue sky law, and New York's executive law, where they're looking into the business practices in the real estate industry, as well as taking a civil enforcement action to protect tenants. So they are certainly looking to enforce those laws and regulations. The New York AG's office circulated to local law enforcement, police departments, and prosecutors across the state of New York guidance on unlawful eviction, tenant harassment, and making sure that developers and landlords are abiding by the moratoriums that are in place. And so that's going to continue. You know, the economic fallout from the pandemic is going to last for years. And so I believe state AGs are going to be dealing with this issue for years, and they're going to be dealing with issues of regulating the real estate industry. So it's definitely going to be a growth area.
I agree. Rob, do you think it's going to be the same in Massachusetts?
You know, Massachusetts does not have the same enforcement structure that you folks do in New York and other states do for housing. There's obviously the eviction moratorium, and they will. I'm sure they're going to investigate any allegations of violations of the moratorium. But I actually think you'll also see some enforcement from HUD. People forget a lot about HUD OIG. They have criminal special agents that work for them, and I wouldn't be very surprised if they start bringing some enforcement actions, either civil or criminal, to look into this. I'm dealing with them now on a few matters in Massachusetts where they work very closely with the state AG, and over water bill type issues, very kind of de minimis violations of HUD regulations. So don't be surprised if you see them complementing enforcement in states like Massachusetts, where you just don't have large units of AGs enforcing the state or federal law.
Right. I think that's a really great point. And I agree with both of you. We're going to continue to see a lot of activity. The financial consequences of the pandemic on the real estate market, we're going to be dealing with it for years to come. Hopefully there will be a really strong recovery, but I think the enforcement landscape is going to be super busy. If time permits, I'll ask my question at the end, but without further ado, I want to turn it over to Nicole to start asking some of your questions of our panelists.
Thanks, Erica. Well, as a healthcare attorney, I have to start with a question in that space, and I want to talk about opioids. This question is for Travis and Rob, of course. Chime in if you have thoughts. So just yesterday, the Senate confirmed a new Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy. He has said that his top priority is ending the coronavirus pandemic, but he also says that he plans to focus on the opioid epidemic. And actually, this is something he was trying to overcome when he was Surgeon General under President Obama. We know there's ongoing litigation in New York and Massachusetts against Purdue Pharma. Travis, can you tell us a little bit about that litigation and what you expect to see in this space?
Absolutely. So I think you're right to lead off with opioids in the category of healthcare, because AG's offices are keenly focused on combating the opioid epidemic. They have been for a couple of years now, and they're going to continue to be. New York has pending litigation against Purdue Pharma and other opioid manufacturers that was initially set for trial last year. It was rescheduled for this spring, and just a couple of weeks ago, it was kicked to later in the summer, and that's expected to go to trial. Massachusetts also has pending litigation against the opioid manufacturers. So it is a priority. It's going to remain a priority. It's a priority for the federal government as well, and it's a priority across the political spectrum. I think it's one of the few areas where both Democratic and Republican AGs across the country agree that this is a major problem, that people are suffering, and that the manufacturers and distributors and the financial backers of opioid knew about this problem for a long time and continued to push it on the public. So they're going to continue to take their shots. I think one thing that's interesting about the way that the state AGs have addressed this issue is that, opposed to a lot of other major legal issues that they've dealt with in multi-state actions brought mainly in federal courts, they've kind of gone at this state by state. And I think the thinking there is that they're going to take as many shots at the opioid manufacturers as possible, and they're going to kill them by death by 1,000 cuts. It's not going to be one big multi-state action where the opioid manufacturers settle and they atone for their past wrongs and move on from it. They're trying to shut down the industry. And so, you see these individual state actions. They're coordinated. Make no doubt that shortly after New York's litigation was brought, Massachusetts announced their litigation. So certainly they were coordinated in that aspect, but they've made a conscious decision to go at it state by state and to really hit these manufacturers hard. And they're also bringing actions against the enablers of the opioid manufacturers. So you've had state actions against McKinsey and Company for the consulting and marketing that they've done for opioids. Just this week, Nevada entered into a $45 million settlement with McKinsey because of the work that McKinsey did for opioid manufacturers. And earlier, they entered a $573 million multi-state settlement around the beginning of the new year. So AGs are focused on this. The federal government's going to be focused on this. And I think the end game is to shut down the opioid market completely. And they're going to take out, they're going to not rest until they're able to do that.
Yeah, I'd like to add on that, to that. You know, I've been involved in some of that litigation, and you know, I think that gravy train is probably coming to an end, right? If you look at how many states have gone after the opioid industry, you know, they're all getting their pound of flesh. They're all getting paid. They'll eventually move on to another deep pocket payer on whatever industry it is, right? Whether it's antitrust or what. And I think they are running out of runway. You know, going after Purdue, going after McKinsey, they're getting their settlements. And you know, I understand that the greater public, the way the issue's framed, think that opioids need to be banned. And frankly, I think that's a mistake, right? There are a lot of good uses for opioids, right? A lot of people do forget that, you know, cancer patients need these drugs. People at the end of life need these drugs. Were there abuses? There most certainly were. And I think the industry, it's heavily regulated to begin with. It will be more heavily regulated. But the point of opioids, there is an actual need for it, right? Mistakes were made, and these companies will atone. The bigger problem now that I don't think is being addressed, at least not by the state governments and the AGs, and they're going to have to step up, is illegal opioids from overseas, right? Fentanyl, things that are, you know, chemicals that are getting shipped from Mexico, from China, and you're seeing the true illicit drug trade, right? And that, frankly, is what's leading to a lot of death and addiction on the street. It's heroin laced with fentanyl that's coming from China, that's coming from India, that's coming from Mexico. And I just don't see the state AG stepping up to police that, right? I went through a lot of their press releases over the past few days to get ready for this. And, you know, a good tip for anybody who wants to know what the AGs are up to, just go to the National Association of Attorneys General, and there's a press release section. You scroll through there, you know, it's like state after state, all 50 do one thing, then all 50 do another thing. Like, it's kind of, they all, once somebody, you know, is the first to kind of break that dam, they all jump in, right? I think they're going to have to do a better job of filling the void between what the federal government and the DEA can police and what the local police departments can police. And that is a huge gap. You know, I've been saying that since I was a state AG. And, you know, I have a sort of a rare background that I was a local prosecutor, a state prosecutor, and a federal prosecutor, and a regulator. So I've really seen it from all different angles. And the state AG in most states can really police stuff that is too small for the feds to do, but way too big for the local governments to do. But that is a vast amount of criminals dealing, you know, cocaine, you know, fentanyl, heroin, back in the day, weed. And I think they're going to have to step into that again, because from scanning the press releases, I don't see a lot of local AG law enforcement action, like against the true cartels who are moving this stuff. And I think they're going to have to step into that again, you know, doing wiretaps, working with the state police, working proactively with the federal government. I think you'll see that as a trend in opioid enforcement, because, you know, someday, you know, Purdue and the other big, you know, McKenna and McKinsey, they're not going to step into this again, right? They're not going to step on that landmine again. So you're not going to be able to keep going after them for repeat business in the opioid space.
Do you think that this is going to be coupled with more regulations? Because I think you're right that they're not going to completely outlaw opioids. There are legitimate uses for them. So maybe that's what has to happen, greater regulation in the area. Would you agree?
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Yeah. And you know what? To be honest with you, I think it was heavily regulated, right? And the laws were in place. Like, the regulations were there. They just needed to be enforced.
Right. Okay. So moving on, it looks like the Biden administration has made some recent appointments that are signaling a hard line on the antitrust space, particularly in the big tech industry. So I was wondering from Rob or Travis, what are you thinking in terms of how these federal appointments might impact enforcement priorities at the state level when it comes to antitrust, and what kind of trickle-down effect might we be able to expect for an industry like big tech?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I think what you're seeing now is, under the Trump administration, you could see that looking back through the old press releases, you could see the state AGs going after Facebook, going after Google, and like I said in the beginning, I think they were filling that void of enforcing the antitrust laws. You will, I think, now, if you enter the Biden administration, the feds get much more aggressive in that space and probably jump the line on the states. I think the states are still going to, litigate their matters and try to get whatever, recompense they want, whether it's they want, money, or they want, Google to break up its monopoly. But I think the feds are going to take the laboring oar on that one. The states will be there and, of course, be filing not only their motions, but their press releases. They're going to want to, take some credit for, going after Facebook or Google or, Twitter or, you name it, LinkedIn may be next for us professionals. But, I think they will be more active in that space than the Trump administration.
And I agree with that 100%. I think that's, especially when it comes to big tech, that's going to be an area of emphasis. The states have been bringing antitrust actions against big tech companies. There's pending actions against Google and Facebook, but also the feds have recently jumped into that as well with their own actions against both Google and the Federal Trade Commission bringing an action against Facebook back in December. So, I think that the Biden administration will move more quickly than the Trump administration did in this area. I think when it came to big tech, in other areas they were more restrained on the antitrust front, but when it came to big tech, I think ultimately the DOJ and other regulators were willing to move, and they did move toward the end of the Trump administration. But I think you're certainly going to see an uptick in that under the Biden administration and more coordination with the states on that front.
And Travis, don't you agree that antitrust is another area like opioids where I think you do have more agreement between the left and the right in terms of, maybe for different reasons, I think. But, I think that's something that the Republicans and Democrats can agree on. Like, yeah, Google maybe should be broken up. Maybe it's a monopoly. And, we don't agree with Facebook's monopoly. I find there's more, common ground there.
Absolutely. You see that not only in the actions that are being brought, but the public hearings before Congress over the past year. Everyone seems to be targeting big tech in one way or the other. So it's certainly an area where both Republicans and Democrats have some agreement. They may not agree on the underlying reasons, but they definitely agree in terms of trying to take some type of enforcement action against these big tech companies. So I agree with that 100%.
So this actually dovetails nicely into something that I wanted to talk about, and that's coordination with the federal government. We had Trump was a Republican, and now we have Biden, who's a Democrat, and certainly we can expect to see shifts along party lines with the AG's office and how they now coordinate with the federal government. So Travis, how are you expecting to see that kind of shift manifest?
Sure. So, certainly there are some limited areas where I think there's agreement across the political spectrum. We just discussed antitrust. I think also cybersecurity and data privacy is another area where I think both Republican and Democrat state AGs and the federal government, regardless of administration, is kind of on the same page. But there are a lot of major differences in big legal areas that there's a wide divergence between what the Republican AGs and what the Democratic AGs are willing to do. And how that looks depends a lot on what the current administration is and who's in charge and what their priorities are. So certainly under a Republican administration, we have Republican AGs that are supporting the policies and regulations put forth and challenging the federal government less. And under Democratic administrations, you have Democratic AGs who are challenging the federal government less. And the reverse is true as well. And so, the politics matter. We can't forget that at the end of the day, most of the state AGs across this country are elected officials, except for a couple of states, such as New Jersey, where they're appointed by the governor, or Tennessee, where it's appointed by the Supreme Court. Most of the states, they're elected officials. Many of them have not been practicing attorneys for years. They've been career politicians. And so the politics matter, and they see things through that particular lens. And they support the policies of their like-minded politicians. So for instance, on the environmental front, you have already Texas and other Republican AGs have challenged the Biden administration's pullback of the permit for the Keystone Pipeline. So right there is a prime example of how Republican AGs are starting to move against the federal government. And you'll see other circumstances like that develop over the next year as well, as the Biden administration moves forward with other regulations and laws get passed by a Democratic legislature. You've also had Ohio that's already challenged the tax mandate under the new COVID relief law that was just passed recently. So those things are going to take place. And it usually takes place when it comes to high profile, very contentious legal issues of the day. So for instance, the Affordable Care Act, that's been litigated left and right, and it's going to continue to be litigated, and Republican AGs will challenge it, and Democratic AGs will try to uphold it. When it comes to immigration and things like the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, you're going to have Republican AGs challenging aspects of that, and you're going to have Democratic AGs trying to uphold it. So you're going to definitely see that change, and you're seeing it already with the new Biden administration and what state AGs are doing, and you're going to continue to see it. And it's just an aspect that you have to be cognizant of when it comes to state AG practice, because at the end of the day, as I led off with, they are elected officials and the politics matters.
Definitely. And actually, you touched on environmental, which is a space that I wanted to get Rob's thoughts on. I know that, Rob, you had a recent settlement with the Massachusetts AG in that space. And I've been watching the Environmental Protection Division of the Massachusetts AG's office. I see that there have been a lot of recent appointments and shifts, and they seem to track the hard line that the Biden administration is going to be taking on environmental protection. So what are your thoughts on what we can expect in that space?
Yeah, and before I get to that, I want to second what Travis said. Everybody has to remember, these are very politicized offices. Most state AGs were politicians before they got there. They're going to be politicians after. A lot of them want to go to either Congress, and you see that frequently from the bigger states, or they want to become governor. So they have they have a great press apparatus. They know how to get their message out. Like I said earlier, if you go to that National Association of Attorneys General page and go to the press releases, if you look at 19 and 20, and even before that, Trump's name appears in almost every press release title, right? The Trump administration is getting sued for X or Y or Z, and it's almost daily, right? And you can see what the flavor of the month is, right? It goes from suing the meat packers for monopoly to suing Google for monopoly, and then Facebook. So you can see those trends amazingly when you look at that website. So, and I think you're going to see it now, like Travis said, now the Republican AGs who want to become governor or go to Congress or go to Senate are going to start suing the Biden administration, right? Because that is what their voters want to see, and that's how they're going to get their name out there. But yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. In terms of environmental enforcement, I think it's going to be almost more of the same in states like Massachusetts, New York, California. I find those offices very aggressive in policing even the most minor infractions of the Clean Water Act and the other, all the panoply of environmental laws. I just recently dealt with the AG's office last year on an environmental matter which involved, violations of the Clean Water Act. And I think a lot of people think of that of okay, like how much gasoline or oil was dumped into a waterway, right? And that's really not what you're dealing with. If you look at a lot of the press releases, it's more de minimis conduct, but they're very aggressive with it. For instance, our client, it's a national gas pipeline company. They had all the permits. They were federally permitted, locally permitted, and while they were building the pipeline, they moved a stump of a tree, and it went underneath a vernal pool, a small vernal pool where frogs and salamanders live, and it damaged the outer rim of the vernal pool. They had environmental specialists there. They fixed it right away, but still, the AG's office brought an enforcement action, right? And we had to work a way to settle that. And you would, I remember when dealing with that case thinking, well, what happened there could have naturally happened, right? Like there can be a storm that rolls through Massachusetts and a tree could fall down and damage that vernal pool. I'm sure that happens every time we have a storm. And it's kind of just the way of life. But yet, if you're building a pipeline and accidentally bump a log, which moves the vernal pool, you're paying, a six-figure settlement, right? But that's so my advice to companies that are doing construction or get anywhere close to any of the environmental agencies or clean air or clean water violations, you have to be very cognizant of it and make sure you hire experienced counsel who have worked either in those offices before or have dealt with those offices before, because that litigation can be very costly for companies if in fact it turns into full-blown enforcement actions and filings in court. I think what you can see by looking through the press releases, 99% of these matters settle. So you need to have somebody on your side to help you through that process.
Absolutely. I want to turn it back over to Erica so that she can ask her last topic.
Sure. So the last topic I had for discussion is another hot button issue, and I'm not sure if it's even on the radar of different attorneys general, but it's cannabis. Similar to, again, our governor is in the news every waking moment, and in New York right now, we're in budget discussions, and every time I look at the news, we're closer to legalizing cannabis in New York. However, last time I checked, cannabis is not legal on the federal level. So I'm curious, love to hear from both Travis and then Rob. What will that look like if cannabis is legal on a statewide level, but it's still illegal on a federal level? And is there something that we think different state attorneys general will do if we start to see legalized cannabis in, let's say, New York, for example?
So, as Erica mentioned, I think New York State is very close to legalizing recreational marijuana. As many states across the country have done so already, and it's been trending that way over the past couple of years. New Jersey just legalized it in the last couple of months, and currently there are two separate bills pending before the New York State Legislature. One, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, is a standalone legalization bill, and the other one, the Cannabis Regulation and Taxation Act, is part of Governor Cuomo's budget proposal for this year. And so I think I'm pretty certain that one of those will be passed, and that recreational marijuana will become legal in New York at some point this year. The role of the Attorney General, I think, will be very limited in regards to marijuana regulation in New York. Both of the proposed bills have create a new agency, basically called the Office of Cannabis Management, that's in charge of regulating the industry and oversight. And so I think the AG's office's role will be very limited. However, with this new state agency that's being proposed in the legislation, I do see a possible conduit for prosecutions out of the AG's office for unlawful distributing, manufacturing, marijuana outside of the legal sphere that's created by the new legislation. So that may be an area where the AG's office plays a role, but outside of that, I think it'll be very limited. And I think overall, this is not an area that the AG's office in New York will want to jump into. They've been very keen on criminal justice reform. This has been packaged as a criminal justice reform legislation to help deal with the past wrongs of the war on drugs and the number of people who have been incarcerated and have to deal with lasting impacts of having convictions on their record related to marijuana use. So if anything, I think the AG's office is certainly supporting these efforts and will have a very light touch once recreational marijuana use is legalized in New York.
Hey, Rob?
Yeah, I have a lot to say on this. We don't have a lot of time left. I am the co-chair of Nixon Peabody's cannabis practice, and Travis, I agree that the AGs may not think they have a large role to play here, but they really should. I think they do have a big role to play. What they need to do, particularly the Democratic ones, they need to lobby the Biden administration to fix the way payments occur with cannabis. Earlier today, there was a verdict in the Southern District of New York against 2 men for bank fraud, and they were facilitating the payment of cannabis on the Visa MasterCard network so that people could buy cannabis using credit cards. That's how people want to pay. Unfortunately, because it's federally illegal, it is money laundering and violates a whole host of federal statutes, not only to possess the cannabis and sell it, but to transact the money that you need to buy it. So that's great that New York wants to legalize it. That's great that it's legal here in Massachusetts, but there's no way to legally pay for it. And people say, well, no, you can use cash. No, that's illegal too. That's federal money laundering. You could get in trouble depositing that in your bank, right? That's the only way to avoid bank fraud prosecution. But a lot of people don't realize the feds are enforcing the financial fraud laws behind this in terms of bank fraud. The allegations there are that people were using their credit cards and the banks weren't aware, and the credit card companies weren't aware that these were cannabis transactions. And the testimony during that trial, which went on for 3 weeks, made crystal clear the banks want nothing to do with cannabis. The credit card companies want nothing to do with it. So I think the AGs should do their best lobbying the Biden administration in Congress to have that fixed.
Great. So that'll be our next panel. We can have a whole panel on
Whole hour.
cannabis. Exactly.